Teachers, welcome back. Hello, all you teachers out there, future teachers, teachers in training, and people looking to teach overseas. My name's Robbie. I'm from Premium Teachers, and today I'm going to be talking about the details that make the difference, how to make your lesson plans longer and more effective. Really, it's all about the details. It's the difference between salted and unsalted French fries. It's that 1 degree change of temperature that turns water into ice, and instead of asking, is everything okay? You ask, what's your problem? It doesn't seem like much, but after it's all over, you know that it could have been better, and with just a little something more, it could have changed a lot. And that's what we're going to cover here today. What makes a lesson plan work, and also what drives it. We're going to talk about my troubles with my own lesson plans when I first started teaching, and I'm going to give you an example of my lesson plans and go over the problems. The second thing is going to be what I found out is that there's two things that critically impact your lesson plans, and those are the activities that you have and also your timing. The third thing we'll talk about is 5 key activities that you can do during your class that will really help to make your class more meaningful and enrich the content. Now there are many more activities out there, but I'm just going to go over 5 basic key activities that you can do immediately. The next point is going to be the revised lesson plan. So I'm going to take the lesson plan from my original point, my troubles with my own lesson plans, and I'm going to add the 5 key activities and show you a revised lesson plan, which is actually much better. And then we're going to talk about timing. In this, I'm going to tell you the power to control time itself. I know that's something we all want to do. And then I'll give my final thoughts, like my insights into what I've learned through this whole thing. And then at the end, I'm going to give out my personal assignment. Okay, so assuming you watched the first video in this series and you've put together a lesson plan, or even if you didn't, you can just look at one lesson plan that you've done before. We need to get into the details of what you'll do and won't do, and that's what this video is all about. It's to help you get a little bit tighter with your actual actions in the class and how you'll execute everything you put down in your lesson plan. I know this is what you need because I recall my first few lesson plans and many of my lesson plans during my first few years of teaching, and unfortunately there were fails after fails after fails. In my early days of teaching, I had the chance to work for a lady named Kate, and she was one of my mentors in this area, and she showed me how to write a lesson plan. She also had me observe her classes, and she hoped that by watching I'd be able to just copy what she was doing or just take my cues from her and be able to cope with and effectively teach a class. So what I would do is I would sit there and I'd watch her go through an hour-long class writing things on the whiteboard, and then the class, the students raising their hands to answer questions and doing reading and grammar exercises, and it was like exactly as you thought a class should look. And then in no time, an hour would go by, and every minute, like every single minute, was accounted for, and it was used with like expert precision. So what I do, I took notes on what she was doing, and I wrote my lesson plans the same way that she coached me. But when it was my turn to step in front of the class, oh my gosh, an hour seemed endless. And if my lesson plan was separated into 3 parts, with me assuming that each part would be 20 minutes long, 1 hour, 20 minutes long, 3 parts, I would do it all, and then I would look at the clock, and I would find that, oh my God, I still have like 45 minutes to go. So I had to ask myself, oh my gosh, what am I going to do for 45 minutes? And then the panic would set in, and I'd fumble around and grasp for anything to fill up the time. It was it was just a terrible feeling, and I came away feeling embarrassed, but I had to ask myself some serious questions and had a few ideas about what went wrong. One of the first things that I thought about was, maybe I wasn't preparing enough material for an hour-long class, which is a very common thing that I've seen a lot of new teachers do. Maybe I need to present more content in class, is what I thought. But I knew I was wrong. And that was because Kate was coaching me. She was telling me what to do during each class. And she was an experienced teacher. And she knew that the material she told me to do would actually be enough to fill up an hour. So on that one, I was totally blank. The second thing I came to was a question. It was, how did Kate present the same material as me for an hour, but I could only do it for 15 minutes? And when I asked her how she did it, she showed me exactly what she had written in her lesson plan. But then when I did it again, it was short. So obviously something wasn't right. Both of these problems are related to each other, and I want to share with you the secret that she never told me. Now, there are two fixes that really changed my teaching, and by adding these to your lesson plans, you'll be able to seriously enrich the content and power of your lessons. So, the first is having activities that you can do for each phase of the lesson, and the second thing you do is timing. These two aspects are related because you can only do so much with the students given the length of the class. So what you have to do is choose your activities according to how long the class is, because each activity takes a set amount of time, obviously. So let's examine a case to illustrate the situation and the way to fix it. So for example, when I was working for Kate, if I had a lesson plan for grammar focused on present perfect simple, with the class doing 3 exercises from the workbook, then my goal was to introduce the topic and the focus. Then have the students understand the relevance of studying present perfect simple and how this topic relates to their lives. And then the third thing was to teach the students how to do the workbook exercises. So we start with the lesson plan, and Kate used to show me her lesson plan, and it looks something like this. She would put down the topic, and then she would have an intro, and she would just write introduce the lesson, and then time words, and then show the time words that go with present perfect simple, and then she would do the affirmative form of the sentence and show how to form the affirmative sentence, and then she would do the negative form of the sentence and she would show the students how to form the negative. And then she'd do the interrogative, which is a question form, and she would show how to do that. And then she would do some prep questions, which would test the kids. And then she would start with the workbook and go and do exercises B, C, and D. Okay, I'd look at it, and then I'd make my lesson plan look exactly like that too. I'd walk into class thinking I was totally ready to do whatever was on the list. I'd get up there, start with the first one, present the information, write it all on the whiteboard out to the end, look at the clock. Only 15 minutes had gone by, my presentation's totally done. I'd look at the class, they'd look at me, I'd start to panic, start sweating, fumble my way around, shuffle papers, and go through the bookwork in 45 minutes when really the bookwork should only take around 15 minutes, and we'd have success and failure in workbook because my class would be working tentatively. The big thing was my presentation was just not thorough enough for the mid-level students to feel confident enough, and for the low-level students who were totally lost after what I said. The high-level students seemed like they were okay, and it kind of made me feel like I was doing okay, but then when I would go and check their work, they would always have mistakes too. And I found that there were parts of it that I couldn't quite explain to them clearly, except that I knew the answer, but I didn't know how to explain the answer to them, so I'd have to give them something like, well, that's just, guys, that's just the way it is. English isn't perfect. And then I'd move on to avoid having to explain something I didn't understand and kind of just leave them hanging. It was a terrible feeling. So, still left with that question over my head, what was wrong? And then I got a chance to go back in and watch Kate do her class, and this time what I did is I timed how long she spent on each part of her lesson plans, and my timing was totally terrible. I wanted to check hers, and to my surprise, she was taking what I was finishing in like 3 minutes, and she would stretch that out into like 15 minutes totally effortlessly. And that's what I noticed what exactly she was doing, and it dawned on me what was going on. It's actually pretty simple. What Kate didn't tell me was that each part of her lesson plan actually consisted of 2 or 3 mini parts. She didn't tell me that because she was so used to standing in front of the class and teaching. For her it was just so natural. And she had all of her own tricks in teaching and her own teaching activities. And for her, it was just habit. So she didn't even have to think about it. It was like, putting on socks or tying shoes. So, of course, she wouldn't write that down on her lesson plan, every single activity she'd do, because she had already memorized it and it was ready to go, which I realized is what every good teacher needs. A routine of 5 key different activities that they can seamlessly weave together during the course of a lesson. So let me explain a little bit. The first one is called attention grabbers. It's a signal to draw attention to yourself when you notice that the attention of the class is, waning a little bit. These are actions to stop the flow of the class so that the teacher can restart everyone or reset everyone to the intended path. Depending on the personality of the teacher and of the personality of the class, it could be anything from simply calling someone's name who's drifting, could be raising your voice, or having all the students stand up and take a break and move around for a few seconds. Something to interrupt their current pattern and to reset. So the second activity I have is called fill in the blank. So while you have the attention of the class, you have to get them used to consistently paying attention by regularly starting sentences and then stopping mid-sentence, waiting for someone to fill in the blank or for the class to fill in the blank together. When you start with a new class, you have to train them by deliberately stopping and telling them that they need to finish this sentence. Having a sharp eye and calling on people who aren't paying attention also encourages the class to stay engaged, since each individual knows you'll call on whoever isn't paying attention. Key activity number 3 is group repetition. Now, similar to fill in the blank, this is an exercise which will have the class repeat words as you're giving your presentation. So it's best to write key words on the whiteboard and then point to them or give some kind of physical indication that this is important. You can also get the class used to repeating key words by using a familiar intro phrase such as, "And now at the top of page 63, lesson 4, or maybe something like, "Today we are studying blank," and then you'd wait for them all to repeat whatever you said. And if they don't, you would then give them a cue again, and then this would begin their understanding of the new habit. And this can also help to refocus the class if they start to get off topic. Activity number 4 is called individual repetition. Giving each student a turn to repeat a word or phrase helps you to judge their pronunciation and also their ability to remember words. It may sound like you're teaching a parrot to talk, but there is a more important focus to this. Being able to hear 10 words in a row and then repeat them is a skill that everyone can learn. It tells you about their comprehension, since it is much more difficult to repeat a sentence you don't understand rather than one you do. So, to illustrate this, imagine that I give you 10 random words and then I just ask you to repeat them. It's more difficult than repeating a series of words in a sentence which express a complete thought. This is a must-have since it is such a strong indicator of their overall comprehension. So obviously not all students will be able to repeat a 10-word sentence, but it is where you want them to be eventually. Key activity number 5 is application exercises or just practice questions. This is any exercise where the student has to apply knowledge in the way the teacher wants them to. I always give the class a specific model to follow, which focuses on one distinct part of the lesson, and then we'll practice each part of it before putting the whole lesson together. So what I'll do is I'll usually get the class to create their own sentences, or I'll play some kind of Q&A game to help get them into the mood. The teacher will then apply these 5 skills into their teaching and then use them during the lesson. Attention grabbers can be used at any time and are so helpful for resetting the class if there's ever a disruption. Fill in the blank, group, and individual repetition can be used when you're making main points or delivering the information part of the lesson. Application exercises can be used after making main points or at the end when you want to test the class's knowledge. So now knowing that, your list of things to do on the lesson plan suddenly doubles or even triples, and that's how you go from 15 minutes to 60 minutes without being at a loss for things to do. So what I want to do now is get back to the original lesson plan and then see how it's changed. Okay, so back to the lesson plan, but now it's the revised present perfect simple lesson plan. With our intro, you'd have to tell the class uh, what present perfect simple is, but then you'd also have to show them so that they can relate to it by using some kind of example which clearly states it. So for that, I try to present some kind of like funny situation in which present perfect simple would be used in all three sentence forms. So my lesson plan would change into this. Number one, the intro. I would introduce the lesson, and then I would tell the story of the passed out pilot. So what that is it would be a situation where the pilot of the airplane is passed out, and then the co-pilot goes back to the people on the plane, and he would say to them, "Hey, has anyone ever flown an airplane before?" Someone would stand up, be a little kid, he'd stand up and say, "Yeah, I have." And the pilot would look at him and say, "How long have you been a pilot?" And then the boy would say, "Actually, I've never flown a real airplane, but I've flown many planes in video games." And then what I would do is I would go back through each part. I'd check for comprehension of the whole dialogue, and then what I would do is I would highlight each sentence in the dialogue to show them whether it's an affirmative, negative, or a question. And then instead of just showing the time words, what I would do is I would define each one of the time words, and then we would play a quick game to review it. After that, we'd move on to the affirmative sentences, where I would show them how to form it, give each person a chance to recite my sentence from the whiteboard, and then I get each person to make their own affirmative sentence and share it with the class. Then after everyone has given their sentence and I've gone through the corrections with them if they've had any, we'll move on to the negative sentence. So I'd use the example of the affirmative sentence and then tell the class how easy it is to turn an affirmative sentence into a negative sentence by just adding the word not. Then I'd let them guess the positioning of the word not and create an example sentence from the sentence on the whiteboard. Then again, I give each person a chance to recite my sentence from the whiteboard, and then get each person to make their own negative sentence and share it with the class. Then we'd move on to the interrogative sentence, and I'd ask the class to turn the affirmative sentence into a question. So I'd wait for some to give up the answer, or for just one or two tries, but if no one bites, I'd reveal that the secret to it is so simple, and it's just done by switching the positioning of two words. Then I'd give a couple examples of switching two random words in the sentence before getting the class to recognize or revealing the true answer. Again, I give each person a chance to recite my question from the whiteboard and then get each person to make their own question and share it with the class. After that, we would move on to our preparation questions. Having reviewed the ways to form the tense, I'll do some practice on specific areas of the lesson so that the students will be ready to work on the workbook. If there are 3 questions, like in my lesson plan, then I do 3 different practice exercises. For each one, I do a group example and then test their understanding by starting a question and then stopping at key points in the answer to elicit answers from the class. This is very important for keeping the group engaged. I always call on those who I feel are not engaged enough, and there's a lot of test talking going on while I'm doing this. If there is a lot of people finishing your sentences or solving parts of the equation, it's a really good sign that you're onto something. But if there's a lot of silence, then that kind of tells you that the class needs more time just to work on that piece that they don't know, and you now know what to concentrate on. Finally, we'd move on to the workbook exercises B, C, and D. Checking the time, we'd have to get going on the bookwork, and if I felt that the class needed more time, I'd work with the class as a group, working through each question together, calling on each student to answer certain parts of the question and staying engaged in the activity. It's important to have the students taking part in solving the problems and not just copying down answers as you do them on the whiteboard. It can't be that easy. They will not retain knowledge they didn't work for. Alternatively, if there is plenty of time and you feel that the class is doing pretty well, you could just introduce the exercise and what it's telling them to do, and then let the class work on it by themselves, giving them a set amount of time. At the end of the time limit, pass in the workbook or individually correct their assignments. Alright, and now let's get all psychedelic and I tell you about the power to control time itself. Time is limited in your class. You only have a certain amount of time for each thing, so as you can see from my lesson plan, each activity contained within a lesson plan is used to create better content so that it takes up chunks of time. So for each step, What I would do in my lesson is that I'd have it made of four parts: an introduction to the part I'm doing, then an example and an explanation of the example. Then we do a round of repetition of the example, and then students get to try it on their own in a controlled setting. Now, when we're talking about time for the whole lesson, I have a very rough time schedule for you to follow. What I'd usually do is 10% of the time should be spent doing the introduction. 20% of the time should be spent on the formation and explanation. That's your lecture part of the presentation. After that, 20% should be spent doing practice exercises, which test their comprehension. And then, if there is book work, you'd have to spend 50% of the time working on that or on other focused activities. And obviously, this is just rough estimates, so you'd have to adjust depending on if it takes a longer explanation for the lesson, or if the book work or exercises are difficult or easier, then you may need to spend more or less time working on it. So the secret of time controlling here is timing yourself, taking note of how long it takes for you to get through each activity. And to do this, you're probably going to have to go through some trial and error with your class before you get it right. Then, after a while, you'll be able to control the time, since you'll have more experience with how long you need to say or show something and how long it will take the students to do something. Ideally, I always try to account for enough time to get through all four parts, but if I need to get through it really quickly, what I will do is I will end up dropping the last exercise from a section. So what we'll do is we'll go back to the lesson plan. For example, if we look at the negative part, what I would do is that if I notice that we are running short on time, I would go to the very last exercise here, and that would be get each person to make their own negative sentence and share it with the class. And what I would do, I would just drop it, and then we move on to the next part. And again, if I needed more time, what I would do is I would go on to the last part. If I didn't have time for them to do that, I would just drop it. And additionally, if I noticed we were really running late, then again, what I would do is I would just take the last exercise I was working on, drop that, move on to the next thing, and hopefully I'd be able to get it in later on. You can also add in the same way. So if you feel the class is not really ready to move on to the next phase, then you can spend more time by giving another round of repetition or another controlled example, and then working through it in the same way, step by step. After that, you try another question for the students to try on their own. So up here, what I would do in the intro, the story of the pastel pilot, to make this intro even clearer, the little dialogue, what I would do is I would probably draw some kind of picture. I'm not a very good artist, but over the years I've gotten okay. And what I would do is I would draw a picture so that the students would be drawn into that and start to focus. Then on the next part, the time words. After I gave it all out and we did a review of the game, if I didn't feel they were getting it, I would just add another example and then review it again. And then also for exercise 3, the affirmative sentence, if I thought the sentences that they came out with were full of mistakes or they weren't able to follow the sentence structure, what I would do is I would just go back and review the sentence structure one more time and then do another round of individual sentences. Okay, now my final thoughts on this whole thing. I realize why my old boss, why she didn't break it down for me completely, because I just subbed a class for another teacher at my school recently, and he was going to be sick. So what he did is he did a really responsible thing, and he wrote out a list of the things for the sub teacher to do while he was away. And after I looked at it, honestly, it was a fucking mess. I'm serious. I could not make heads or tails of what was going on. So let me explain. It was like 2 or 3 pages, A4 sheets with handwritten directions for each day. And then there was a lot of notes about what to do written in his own personal shorthand, and there was like 10 or 12 tiny yellow post-its with additional thoughts and tips. And when I looked at it, I was like totally confused due to the apparent complexity of his ideas and the instructions that he put down, even though they were very highly detailed and probably made perfect sense to him. And the reason this was because everyone is like that. We all have our own way of doing things, and when we try to express what's in our heads and the way that we do things and why we do them on paper, it's very difficult. There are a lot of things that words just do not do justice to, and things that we figured out and routines that are hard to explain. like exactly why doing this exercise takes 5 minutes and why that one will take 10 minutes. So, like I said earlier, you'll have to have a few goes at it until you figure it all out. And it's similar to sleight of hand done by a magician, because when you watch, it's hard to figure out what you've seen, but then even when they show you exactly what they're doing and you realize it's even a small move, but it's really, really tough to practice it and do it the way that they do it and make it look the way it's supposed to look. Lastly, I want to move on to our personal assignment now. For the personal assignment this week, what I want you to do is review a lesson plan from the previous assignment, or just review a lesson plan that you've done before. Go through each step that you have planned and add the exercises that have been outlined in this video, and they are fill in the blanks, group repetition, individual repetition, and application exercises. All of these exercises can be tailored to your personal teaching style, and to do that, you'll have to try them out in the way that I've outlined and see what works for you and also what doesn't work for you. Then adjust them to suit your style or just to suit the class's style, and keep on fine-tuning until you have something that really, really works for you, and not just for you, but also you and your class. Also, please don't forget to throw in attention grabbers and also narratives so that the class will stay really, really focused. And so everyone, that brings us to the end, and I'd like to thank everyone for hanging in there with me as I've gone over the details that make the differences in your lesson plans. I really hope that you found a few truly meaty morsels that you'll be able to chew on and will provide you with enough creative nourishment to make your lessons go from 15 minutes to an hour or more. Once again, from me and everyone here at Premium Teachers, I truly loved sharing this with you, and I invite you to revisit this video or many of our other related videos. So, until next time, go get 'em.